He may have scored an early hit. The issue was the unions and Labour's nervous relationship with them. He claimed that unions would once again be all-powerful on the shop floor. Labour would vest workers' rights and trades unions, provided 50% of the workforce vote for them. Then he claimed he'd panicked Labour into changing their policy on the matter. Labour responded by accusing the Tories of nitpicking. So, who's right? Here's Gordon Brewer.
Well, Kirsty, they weren't exactly partying at Conservative Central Office today, but they were a lot more cheerful than they've been recently. It's our first real hit of this election campaign, gushed one official, almost unable to believe his luck. For not only had the Tories forced New Labour to talk about one of its least favourite subjects, the trades unions, but New Labour didn't seem entirely clear what it wanted to say. This is the picture the Tories would like us to have of Britain under Labour, a sort of hell on earth, loosely based on the winter of discontent, where the dead go unburied and garbage piles up uncollected in the streets. So, when a newspaper reported this morning that over 60 companies which didn't want to recognise trade unions would be forced to by a Labour government, the Tories weren't going to miss a trick.
Good morning.
Michael Heseltine's news conference this morning was supposed to be about education, but suddenly the Deputy Prime Minister decided the trade union threat was a much more pressing matter.
It is no longer 50% of a workforce in any company that must vote for union recognition. It is 50% of any section of the workforce. Companies would become battlegrounds.
Labour is proposing to extend trade union rights. Its policy documents say, where a majority of the relevant workforce vote to be represented by a trade union, there should be a legal obligation on employers to recognise a union for collective bargaining. The crucial phrase Michael Heseltine seized on was relevant workforce. If that's defined as a small group, say the clerical workers in a big engineering company, then the company could be forced to recognise a trade union even though a majority of the workforce as a whole doesn't want one. That's the basis for the Tory claims small groups of workers could once again hold companies and the country to ransom. The matter might have ended there, except that Gordon Brown, the Shadow Chancellor, used some of his news conference to suggest a form of arbitration in disputes over definitions of relevant workers, a policy Labour has not put forward before.
A majority of the recognised workforce, that, if there was any dispute about it, to be established by a third party, a judge, and not a matter for a union simply to say that this is the recognised workforce, and for that to be the case. It would have to be decided by a third party if there was any disagreement over that, and that would then be a matter for a judge or for someone like him to make that recommendation.
Later, Robin Cook came up with another new idea.
There is a perfectly well-established body which can deal with this. The Central Arbitration Committee is well accustomed to appointing boards of arbitration to sort out disputes of such a character in relation to labour relations. I'm sure that they can handle it in this case as well.
The Central Arbitration Committee, just in case you didn't know, is a hitherto obscure organisation based inside the ACAS building in central London. By this evening, Labour had merged its new ideas together by plumping for arbitration by the committee, but with a judge sitting on it. But the impression had been given the party was making this up as it went along, an impression reinforced when the committee told Newsnight tonight its chairman hadn't been approached about the idea. It's the broader politics of this that's important. This is the vision Labour wants you to have of the future. Tony Blair in cosy meetings with business leaders planning a future of undreamt of prosperity. But although big companies do tend to recognise unions, most of the employers' federations are against Labour's proposals on union recognition. On the substance of the issue, Labour have a strong case. Their proposals on union recognition are not new, and in that sense the Tories are trying to make an issue out of nothing. And some lawyers specialising in the field say the arbitration proposals, made on the hoof or not, are perfectly sensible. But Labour is vulnerable. One Labour source told me tonight the policy was drafted by people who knew nothing about the unions, and there were a lot more inconsistencies if only the Tories cared to look for them. The Conservatives have squirmed as Tony Blair has cuddled up to his new friends in big business. They now believe they've managed to drive a wedge between the two, and now it's driven in, the Tories intend to keep hammering at it for all it's worth.
Gordon Brewer. Well, I'm joined by Labour's Education and Employment spokesman Stephen Byers, from our Westminster studio by the President of the Board of Trade Ian Lang, and by the Liberal Democrats Matthew Taylor. Stephen Byers, why did Labour feel they had to dream up this idea of a judge today, a policy on the hoof?
Well, it wasn't a policy on the hoof. What we've got is a conference decision arrived at last year which says where a majority of the relevant workforce want to be represented by a trade union, that should be put in place. What we had today was some discussion of the mechanics of that. The position is very clear.
You hadn't planned it out, basically, until today.
Oh, no, we have very clear thinking about how it should be implemented in practice. But what we will do, in government, we will consult with all interested parties. What I can say is this, though, that it will not be for the trade union to determine the relative bargaining unit. That will be done by arbitration and by a judge. That's the proper way to do it. It's done through our employment legislation at the moment. We don't propose anything new.
So if there's only 30 clerical workers in a firm of 500, you might deem that if 16 of them say that they would like union representation, you're not prepared to give it to them?
That will be for the judge to decide. So he will have to be clear in his own mind that there is a real bargaining unit in existence.
But so you are not saying to trade unionists that you're going to give them rights of representation. You're not saying to workers that you're going to give them rights of recognition by trade unionists at all.
What we're saying is we will give that where a majority of the relevant workforce vote for it.
But only if it's a big enough and a viable unit.
And the relevant workforce will be determined by a judge and not by the trade unions.
What if an employer refuses to recognise the rights to belong to a trade union? Are you going to impose fines? What will you do?
Well, we've been looking at the model in America. Now, this was held out by John Major just a couple of months ago in Brussels to be an excellent labour market model that we should look towards, and we've done that. And our recognition proposals are based on the experience in America. It's been in place for 60 years, supported by Republicans and Democrats alike, and it hasn't led to the sorts of difficulties, the sorts of scaremongering that we've seen from the Conservative Party today.
But would employers have the right to refuse union recognition or not?
The majority of employers will accept...
But would they have the right to refuse?
If a majority of the workforce decide that they want to be represented by a trade union, then legally they will be entitled to do that, because our policy towards trade unions is based on fairness and not favours. And we believe it's fair that where a majority of the workforce want it, they should be recognised by a trade union.
So, just to clarify this last point, if an employer refuses what you consider to be a right, then there'll be a system imposed of fines against him or judicial review, for example?
We will want to talk to employers and trade unions as well about the sanctions that will be necessary, but we're confident that with goodwill, which we expect, then employers will recognise the importance of accepting the view of a majority of their employees.
Ian Lang, is this as much as Michael Heseltine can muster on the unions?
Well, I think Michael Heseltine went right to the heart of the matter. The fact is that the Labour Party's policy seems to be coming apart at the seams, and we had Gordon Brown and Robin Cook fighting over it all day. I gather Tony Blair's going to have to rush into print tomorrow to try to paper over the cracks. But what we've just heard from Stephen Byers conjures up all the images of the 1970s. It looks as though we're going to have judges in pyjamas being summoned to resolve demarcation disputes. And we're going to have employers put under enforced statutory obligations to give more powers to trade unions and to go back to the kind of confrontation that we had in the 70s. And that is just one element of Labour Party's trade union policy. But it is significant, I think, that Bill Morris of the TGWU regards this as his #1 priority, more important than any of the other things that the trade unions want. And that's why I think Michael Heseltine went to the heart of the matter.
But the Conservative government, under European legislation, therefore British legislation, already has to allow elected representatives chosen from relevant groups to talk to management in factories. And that has happened without any problems whatsoever.
Well, if you're talking about the works councils under the social chapter, we're not signatories to the social chapter, and we're resisting all the burden of European
but
social...
already elected representatives from the factory floor talk to management about a number of issues, and that is under European legislation which you subscribe to.
But there's nothing wrong with employers talking to representatives of the factory floor. It happens all the time in the best-run companies, and it should continue to do so. What I am against is the imposition of statutory obligations on employers, the giving of new statutory powers to trade unions, which would upset the balance and create a degree of coercion that will strengthen trade unions and release again that spirit of confrontation that so damaged our industrial relations in the 70s. And to make reference to America is preposterous. America is a country where they understand the meaning of enterprise, where they create jobs by the millions year after year. The contrast with that and what happened under Labour governments in the past, in the 60s and 70s, when we let this trade union genie out of the bottle before, is very dramatic indeed and very serious.
Matthew Taylor, you claim the Liberal Democrats are more radical than Labour, so presumably you would entirely support and go further than what Labour are proposing to give statutory rights to the workforce.
Yeah, what Ian Lang is saying is absolute nonsense, and I think that most people would say that if people choose to join a union, and a majority of them join it, want to be represented by that union, they should be represented by it, just as they should have the right not to join.
But Stephen Byers is not actually
to.
saying that would necessarily exist. There would have to be a certain grouping to allow that.
Well, I think that this is really the only criticism of Labour today. It's not that the principle is wrong. The principle is actually right that this recognition should go. But as soon as the Tory party says boo, the Labour goose jumps, frankly, and they have got themselves into a pickle over it. This is a basically very simple issue. It's one which I think the British public see in fairness terms.
But isn't it extraordinary that you were caught in the hop, given that if there is clear blue water in one area, it is on the issue of the unions, and surely, of all people, both Robin Cook and Gordon Brown should have been ready for this, and they weren't.
Our policy has been very clear since last September. It's a majority of the relevant workforce. That's been in place. We haven't jumped to the conservative
policy of the judge
tune.
hasn't been in place.
Well, that's been the detail that we've been working on. It's the detailed mechanics of how we deliver the policy. Work has been going on for a number of weeks.
But there isn't actually a judge sitting at the head of this little-known arbitration committee at the moment, so that is something else new you put in place.
No, it's a judicial body. It acts in a judicial capacity, and everybody who knows how this works knows that it's a judicial body. But the important element is here, and Ian Lang touched on it, about the American model. Ronald Reagan was a great supporter of statutory recognition. What's most disappointing about today is the Conservatives cancelled a press conference to do with education, which is about looking towards the future. And they've raised this scare story to do with a policy which has been in place in America for 60 years, and America has probably got the best capitalist economy in the world.
Isn't it the case, though, as some critics in your own party are saying, that you weren't ready for this, you didn't know enough about employment legislation and what was actually going to be coming at you from the Conservatives during this campaign, which should have been blindingly obvious it was going to come at you from the Conservatives? No, the policy is very clear, and we're prepared to defend that policy. The mechanics and the details which were revealed today are nothing new. We hadn't disclosed them before because very often people are more interested in the policy rather than the detailed mechanics. Well, let's look at this list that appeared in the Daily Mail today of the 63 hit companies that the Labour government would like to see unionised. I should say the unions would certainly like to see unionised. Let's deal with Mercury. Let's deal with that as a company. Do you think it's a bad company because it's not a unionised workforce? Not at all, no. And we've said in our policy documents that many people will choose either not to join a trade union or be union members but don't want the union to be recognised. It will be their choice. There's no compulsion here. It will be for people to make up their own minds. And that's the approach we've adopted. But let's be clear that the Labour Party hasn't transformed itself over the last couple of years to turn the clock back to the 1970s. And that's why we will keep Ian Lang, did you hear that? There will be no compulsion here whatsoever.
That is not so, because they're talking about legislating to enforce these rights. It is a form of coercion. And I must say, I just wish they'd spoken to Jim Mortimer, a former General Secretary of the Labour Party, who was actually head of ACAS at the time when we had to repeal in 1980 the previous arrangements that were in place because they did not work. The fact is that every major employers' organisation has rejected these as being immensely damaging to the future of industrial relations. And to pretend that the Labour Party has a good working relationship with business and that business is helping them prepare their policy for business is preposterous. What this makes